The fluorescent lights of Hargrove City Medical Center had never felt more brutal. Arthur Pendleton had been inside hundreds of hospitals over the course of his life. He knew their rhythms the way a sailor knows the sea, the hushed urgency behind certain footsteps, the particular silence that gathered outside rooms where decisions were being made, the smell of antiseptic that clung to fabric long after you'd left. He'd always moved through those corridors with authority, with purpose, with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly what needed to be done. Tonight, he moved through them as a father, terrified, exhausted, and very nearly broke. Lily was burning up in his arms. She had started running a fever around 2 in the afternoon, a low, persistent simmer that Arthur had monitored with the careful attention he applied to everything concerning his daughter. He'd taken her temperature every 30 minutes, pressed cool cloths to her forehead, given her the appropriate dose of children's paracetamol, and held her hand while she drifted in and out of a restless, uncomfortable sleep. By 8 o'clock in the evening, the thermometer had read 104.2 degrees Fahrenheit, and that was when Arthur stopped waiting. Lily was 7 years old. She had a transplanted heart. There was no such thing as wait and see when it came to Lily. He'd wrapped her in her favorite blanket, the yellow one with small white daisies that she'd chosen herself from a discount bin at a market 3 years ago, before the transplant, before everything changed, and he'd carried her to his truck. The truck was a 1998 Ford F-150 with 210,000 miles on it, a cracked dashboard, and an intermittent heater that Arthur had repaired himself twice already this winter. He drove it carefully, the way he drove everything, with both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road, while Lily murmured softly against his shoulder. "Daddy," she whispered, somewhere on the highway. "My chest feels funny." Arthur's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "I know, sweetheart. We're almost there. Like it's knocking too hard. That's okay. It's just working extra hard tonight because it loves you so much." She made a small sound, half laugh, half sigh, and tucked her face against his neck. "Hearts can't love, Daddy. They're just muscles." Even now, even terrified, he almost smiled. She was her mother's daughter in that way. Practical, precise, always cutting gently through the softness of a metaphor to find the fact underneath. "You're right," he said. "They are. But yours is a very special muscle. You know that." "Because it's strong," she said, already drifting again. "Because it's strong," he agreed quietly. Hargrove City Medical Center was a large, well-regarded private hospital in the east side of the city. Arthur had specifically chosen it when they moved to Hargrove 18 months ago, not because it was the most prestigious hospital in the region, though it was, but because it had the best pediatric cardiology unit outside of a major university hospital, and Dr. Elena Vasquez, who managed that unit, was one of 3 people in this country Arthur trusted completely with his daughter's care. He'd spent the last of his paycheck, the full 2 weeks' worth of earnings from Gallagher's Auto Repair on 3rd Street, getting Lily into a private room. Not because he needed luxury, not because he had any illusions about what that money represented, but because a private room meant quieter monitoring equipment, meant fewer interruptions in Lily's rest, meant a nurse who came when the call button was pressed rather than 20 minutes later. Arthur had done the math before he came. He always did the math. The admission process took 47 minutes, which was 30 minutes longer than it should have been because the front desk administrator seemed to be having a personal conversation on her phone and regarded Arthur's faded jacket and work-roughened hands with the particular disdain of someone who has learned to calibrate their attention according to visible wealth. Arthur waited. He was good at waiting. He had learned, over the past 2 years, that patience was not surrender. It was simply the conservation of energy for the battles that actually mattered. By 9:30, Lily was settled in room 412, which was one of the private suites on the hospital's 4th floor. It was clean and quiet, with a window that looked out over the city lights, and a small pull-out cot for Arthur along the wall. A young night nurse named Priya had taken Lily's vitals and set up the 4 line with steady, competent hands, and Lily had fallen into a deeper sleep as the fluids began to work. Arthur sat in the chair beside his daughter's bed, his elbows on his knees, his clasped hands pressed against his mouth, and watched the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing. He had been watching her breathe with this intensity for 2 years. He did not think it would ever feel ordinary. Every rise and fall of her chest was a gift that had been paid for at a price he could not bear to fully calculate, and he received it each time with the same quiet, aching gratitude. He was still watching when the door to room 412 opened without a knock. The woman who entered first was not hospital staff. Arthur knew that immediately, not just from her clothes, though those were remarkable enough. She wore a dove-gray cashmere coat over a charcoal dress that sat at the precise intersection of professional and devastating, and a single strand of pearls that probably cost more than Arthur's truck. Her dark blonde hair was swept back with an effortlessness that required, paradoxically, considerable effort. She was beautiful in the way that certain things of great expense are beautiful, flawlessly maintained, deliberately assembled, and fundamentally cold. She was followed by a veterinarian in a white coat, a man carrying an expensive-looking dog carrier, a personal assistant in a black suit who was already speaking rapidly into a phone, and, trailing behind them all, the hospital director himself, Dr. Richard Evans, a round-shouldered man of 42 whose smile was calibrated to the exact wattage of whoever stood before him. Right now, that smile was set to blinding. "Ms. Sterling," Dr. Evans was saying, clasping his hands together in a gesture of obsequious hospitality, "I'm so deeply sorry about Maharaja's injury. Our veterinary consultant, Dr. Hammond, is absolutely the best in the region, and I can assure you that room 412 offers everything." The woman, Victoria Sterling, Arthur would learn her name in approximately 3 minutes, had not looked at him yet. She was scanning the room with the detached efficiency of someone assessing a property for purchase. Her gaze moved over the monitoring equipment, the 4-pole, the window, and finally landed on Lily's small form in the bed, and then on Arthur sitting beside her. She stopped. Something moved across her face. Not quite emotion, but the faint shadow of something that emotion had once carved there, long ago, and left its impression in the way great pain always does. Then it was gone, replaced by the kind of careful blankness that requires years of practice. "There's already a patient here," she said flatly, addressing Dr. Evans without looking at him. "Yes, well," Evans began. "I want this room." She said it the way she might say, "I want this table at a restaurant." Without cruelty, exactly, because cruelty implied awareness of another person's feelings, and Victoria Sterling did not appear to be operating in a register that admitted other people's feelings at all. Maharaja is in distress. He needs a quiet room with proper monitoring equipment and temperature control. This one has the right configuration. Evans was already nodding. "Of course, Miss Sterling. Absolutely. We'll have the other party relocated immediately to, excuse me." Arthur's voice was quiet. It was, in fact, so quiet that it should have been easily ignored. But there was something in the quality of it, a steadiness, an absolute refusal to be background noise, that made everyone in the room pause for a fraction of a second. He had risen from his chair. He stood at his full height now, which was just over 6 feet, and in his worn jeans and faded gray work shirt, with his dark hair uncombed and the shadow of 2 days' stubble on his jaw, he looked precisely what he appeared to be, a tired man at the end of his rope, with nothing left to lose except what mattered most. "My daughter has a fever of 104, he said, his eyes moving between Evans and Victoria with calm, measured deliberateness. "She has a heart condition that requires careful monitoring. She is settled, she is resting, and she is stable for the first time in 4 hours. I paid for this room." He paused. "I'm not leaving." Victoria turned to look at him properly for the first time. Whatever she saw, it clearly did not impress her. Her gaze moved down him once, quickly, cataloging. The worn shirt, the cracked leatherwork boots, the hands that were calloused and stained with the ghost of engine oil that never fully washed out. A small, almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes. "Your situation is unfortunate," she said, with the particular flatness of someone for whom other people's situations have ceased to be her concern. "But my dog is also unwell. I'm sure the other rooms are perfectly adequate for your daughter's needs. Dr. Evans will ensure she's comfortable. Ms. Sterling." Arthur kept his voice even with an effort that cost him something. "I understand that your dog is in pain. I genuinely do. But a scratch on a dog's paw is not comparable to." I did not ask for a comparison. A thin edge had entered her voice now, something bright and dangerous. "I asked for this room. Dr. Evans will arrange the transfer. That's the end of the conversation." "It isn't, actually." He held her gaze. "Because I'm not moving my daughter." There was a silence. Then Victoria turned to Evans with the crisp finality of someone closing a file. Handle it. And Evans, who had not risen to the position of hospital director through an excess of moral courage, squared his shoulders and nodded at the two security guards who had been waiting in the corridor. Mr. He glanced at the admissions chart on the clipboard his assistant had produced. Pendleton, I'm going to need you to gather your things and accompany security to, if you move her while she's connected to that floor. Arthur said quietly. You could compromise the line. She needs to stay still. I'll pay for a second private room, if that's available, but Lily does not move tonight. I'm afraid the other private rooms on this floor are occupied, Evans said, with the smooth practiced regret of a man who has rehearsed this kind of lie. He met Arthur's eyes with a particular small satisfaction that people of limited moral imagination experience when they have the backing of power. The general ward is perfectly adequate for your daughters. The general ward has 6 other patients and visiting hours that end at 9. Arthur's jaw was tight. She needs continuous monitoring. She has a transplanted heart. The general ward nurse-to-patient ratio on a Thursday night does not. Mr. Pendleton. Evans's voice had cooled to something approaching contempt. He lowered his voice, but not enough, because the 2 security guards and the personal assistant and the veterinarian and the woman in the cashmere coat could all hear him clearly. I don't know what you do for a living, but I suspect it doesn't involve much medical expertise. Leave the medical judgments to the professionals. Security will escort you now. Arthur looked at his daughter. Lily was asleep. Her small face was flushed, her hair damp against the pillow. The heart monitor beside her bed kept its patient, rhythmic count, 78 beats per minute. Steady. Safe. For now. He looked at the security guards, who had stepped into the room. He looked at Evans, whose expression contained a mixture of performance and genuine contempt. He looked at Victoria Sterling, who had turned away from him entirely and was allowing a staff member to open the carrier and retrieve her dog, a large, elegant Afghan hound with a bandaged front paw and an expression of faintly insulted dignity, and was murmuring to it in a tone that contained more warmth than anything she had offered any human being in this room. Arthur thought about what he could say. He had things he could say. He had, in fact, things he could say that would stop this conversation cold, that would change every dynamic in this room in a single sentence. But that would mean revealing what he had spent 2 years carefully concealing, and he had his reasons for that concealment, reasons that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with protection. So he swallowed it, the way he had swallowed so many things over the past 2 years. He reached for Lily's hand. He held it. Please, he said, and the word cost him more than anything he had spent tonight. She's 7 years old. She's scared of new places when she wakes up confused. Just let her sleep here tonight. Please. Victoria Sterling did not turn around, and the guard stepped forward. Martha Hayes had worked in this hospital for 27 years. She had been a floor nurse, then a charge nurse, then the head nurse of the 4th floor, a title that came with its own small office, a modest salary increase, and the authority to do the thing she cared about most. Ensure that the people in her ward were treated with the basic dignity that illness, by its very nature, stripped away. She had seen every species of human behavior that a hospital could generate: courage and cowardice, generosity and cruelty, the extraordinary grace with which some people faced the worst moments of their lives, and the spectacular smallness that others revealed when they believed that money or status made them untouchable. She had seen it all, but she had rarely, in 27 years, felt the particular sick fury that was rising in her chest right now, watching 2 security guards move toward a man who had asked for nothing except that his sick child not be disturbed. She had recognized Lily Pendleton the moment Arthur had brought her in. She recognized most of her long-term patients, but Lily was not someone you forgot. There was a file in Martha's memory that was organized differently from the others, flagged with a specific kind of care, cross-referenced with a grief so large and so particular that it had lodged itself permanently in her chest like a splinter she had stopped trying to remove. The file was labeled, Heart Recipient, Pediatric. Donor, Sterling James. Age 5. DOB, March 14th. Date of donation, October 9th, 2 years ago. Martha knew Victoria Sterling. She had known her, or known of her, since the worst night of her professional life, which was also the worst night of many people's lives, and which had taken place in this very hospital. She had not spoken to her since then, had not expected to, had filed that particular memory in the category of things that were too sharp to handle without proper protection. And now Victoria Sterling was standing 10 feet away from her, in full imperious bloom, demanding a room for her dog, while the guards reached for the father of the little girl who was alive, still breathing, still here, because of the heart that had been torn out of Victoria's own loss. Martha had held that secret for 2 years. She had held it because it was her professional obligation to hold it. Medical privacy was not a suggestion, it was a law, and it was also, she had always believed, a mercy. Donor families and recipient families did not, in most cases, need to find each other. The grief was too new, too raw, the dynamics too complex. She had seen cases where those meetings went beautifully, healing both families simultaneously, and she had seen cases where they went catastrophically wrong. She had always believed the decision should be made carefully, gently, by trained counselors in controlled settings. But she was watching a security guard put his hand on Arthur Pendleton's arm, and she was watching Victoria Sterling's back, and she was calculating, with the quick, experienced precision of someone who had spent 3 decades assessing what a human being could survive, the specific arithmetic of this moment. She crossed the room. It was not a dramatic crossing. She did not move quickly or make a show of it. She walked the way she always walked, with the steady, purposeful economy of someone who has too many things to do and has learned to do all of them without waste. She touched Evans's arm briefly as she passed him, which made him blink and step back, because Martha Hayes touching your arm with that expression on her face was a signal anyone on this floor had learned to heed. She did not look at Arthur, because if she looked at Arthur she might not be able to do what she had decided to do. She stopped beside Victoria Sterling. The Afghan hound looked up at her with dark, liquid eyes. Victoria was examining the dog's bandage with a focused tenderness that Martha might, under different circumstances, have found touching, the love of a person for an animal, which was often the last safe harbor for love that had been broken beyond its capacity to reach other people. "Ms. Sterling," Martha said quietly. Victoria did not look up. "Whatever it is, handle it with Dr. Evans." "I need 30 seconds of your time," Martha said. "I apologize in advance for what I'm about to tell you. I have thought about this carefully, and I believe you need to know." Something in her voice, the specific gravity of it, the quality of a woman who does not speak unless the words are necessary, made Victoria finally turn her head. Martha leaned in, and she said it. She said it in a voice so low that it carried no further than the 3 inches between her lips and Victoria Sterling's ear. 8 words, or perhaps 9, or perhaps it was 10. Later, no one in the room would agree on the exact count, because no one else had heard them. What they heard was silence, a sudden, complete, absolute cessation of all ambient sound in room 412, as though the words had weight, and that weight had pressed every other noise flat. Then the sound of something hitting the floor. The handbag was Italian leather, midnight blue, and it cost, according to the hallmark on its clasp, approximately $12,000. It hit the linoleum with a sound that was soft and final, like a period at the end of a sentence. Victoria Sterling's face did not change immediately. This was the thing about great shock. It did not announce itself in the way that drama teaches you to expect. It did not come with a gasp or a cry or a trembling lip. It came instead with a terrible stillness, the kind that grips a person who has just received information that is rearranging every piece of furniture in the room of their understanding and cannot yet navigate the new configuration. Her face was white, not pale white, as though the blood had been summoned away from the surface of her skin to do emergency triage somewhere deeper, somewhere more vital. Her eyes moved from Martha's face to the small bed across the room, to the child sleeping in it, to the heart monitor beside the bed, with its steady luminous green line tracing the same patient rhythm it had been tracing for the past hour. 78 beats per minute. 78 beats per minute. 78. The sound that came out of Victoria Sterling was not a word. It was not a cry exactly. It was the sound of a structure giving way, something large and load-bearing that had been under stress for longer than it could hold, finally, catastrophically, surrendering. It was the sound of 2 years of ice breaking all at once. Her knees hit the floor with a weight that made everyone in the room flinch. The security guard stopped moving. The personal assistant froze mid-sentence, her phone pressed to her ear, her mouth open. Dr. Evans took 2 steps forward and stopped, his face confused and slightly alarmed. The expression of a man watching a situation spiral away from everything his risk management training had prepared him for. Even the Afghan hound turned its long, elegant head and regarded its owner with something that looked remarkably like concern. Victoria was on her knees on the linoleum floor of room 412, and she was weeping. Not the graceful, controlled weeping of someone performing grief in a context that permits it. Not the careful, contained tears of a person who has decided that circumstances warrant a show of feeling. This was something rawer and more total. The weeping of a person who has had their wound torn open without warning, who has had the hand they have kept pressed over that wound for 2 years suddenly yanked away, and who is bleeding, quite simply, in front of everyone. Her hands were on the floor. Her head was bowed. The pearl necklace swung forward and caught the light. Ms. Sterling. Evans started, moving toward her with the awkward solicitude of a man who is primarily concerned about liability. Don't. Her voice was barely audible, but the single word stopped him cold. She lifted her head. Her face was ruined, mascara tracking down her cheeks, eyes red, every careful construction of the evening dismantled. She looked, in this moment, not like the ruthless billionaire CEO of Sterling Global Holdings, not like the cold, diamond-clad woman who had walked into this room 8 minutes ago and demanded its occupation for her pet. She looked like a mother. Specifically, she looked like a mother who had been handed, without preparation, a piece of evidence that the worst night of her life had somehow not been entirely the end. Her eyes found Arthur. He was standing very still beside his daughter's bed, his hand on Lily's blanket, his expression carefully controlled, but not entirely. He had understood enough of what had just happened to know the shape of it, even without having heard the words. His eyes were wet. He blinked once. Victoria looked at him, and she opened her mouth, and what came out was barely a whisper. Her heart, she said. Is it? Is he? Is my son? She couldn't finish the sentence. She pressed her hand over her own chest. Martha crouched beside her and put a hand on her shoulder. Yes, she said simply. Lily is James's recipient. The sound Victoria made then was beyond description. She began to crawl. Later, the security guards would describe what they witnessed to their spouses, their friends, anyone who would listen, with the specific shell-shock quality of people reporting a natural disaster. The most powerful woman in Hargrove County, the woman whose financial holdings included 3 of the city's major developments, and whose name appeared on the east wing of this very hospital, moving across a linoleum floor on her hands and knees toward a man in a faded work shirt, sobbing with a completely unguarded desperation that was almost unbearable to witness. She stopped at Arthur's feet. She looked up at him. Please, she said, and it was strange and somehow necessary, that this was the same word he had said to her less than 5 minutes ago, in this same room, from a position of utter powerlessness. Please, can I just want to hear, please. Just for a moment. I just want to hear. She pressed her hand against her own sternum and could not say the rest. Arthur looked down at her for a long moment. His expression was complicated, not cold, not pitying, but something more difficult and more honest than either of those things. He looked like a man facing something he had imagined 1,000 times and had never, in any of those imaginings, found himself prepared for. He took a slow breath, and he stepped aside from the bed. The room had gone very still. Dr. Evans had backed against the wall with his clipboard held in front of him like a shield. The security guards stood near the door with the careful blankness of men who have decided that the best policy is to wait and see. The personal assistant had ended her phone call and was standing motionless by the window, her phone hanging from her hand. The veterinarian was attending to the dog with exaggerated concentration, which was his way of trying not to exist. Martha Hayes remained crouched near Victoria, one hand steady on her shoulder. Arthur did not invite Victoria closer. He simply stopped blocking the way. That was enough. Victoria rose from the floor in stages, using the bed rail for support, her legs unsteady beneath her. She stood beside the bed, looking down at Lily's face with an expression that was completely unlike anything she had worn since she'd entered the room. The arrogance was gone. The cold calculation was gone. What remained was something stripped and essential, a face that had been reduced to its bare emotional architecture. And what that architecture revealed, underneath all the expensive scaffolding, was grief and love and the specific anguish of a parent. Lily slept on, oblivious. She was flushed with fever, her dark hair spread across the pillow, her breathing slow and regular. One small hand lay curled on top of the yellow daisy blanket. She looked, as she always looked when she slept, like something Arthur would defend to his last breath. Victoria reached out her hand. She stopped before she touched Lily, her fingers hovering an inch above the child's hair, trembling. "May I?" she whispered, looking at Arthur. Not a demand. A question so tentative it was almost painful. Arthur's jaw worked. He looked at his daughter, at the steady green line on the monitor, at the woman standing across the bed from him. He was a man of precise control, and that control was costing him something visible right now. He nodded. Victoria placed her hand, very gently, over Lily's heart. The silence in the room stretched and held. Then Victoria closed her eyes. Arthur watched her face. He watched the moment that the beat reached her, the first pulse of it against her palm, and then the second, and then the third. He watched her absorb it the way a person absorbs sunlight after a very long winter, not with joy, initially, but with the particular stunned disbelief of someone who had forgotten that warmth was real. Her breath hitched. "James used to fall asleep on my chest," she said, and her voice was barely sound at all. "When he was a baby, I used to feel his heartbeat against mine, and I thought if I could just hold very still, if I didn't move, nothing bad could ever happen." A pause. I was wrong. Arthur said nothing. There was nothing to say. He was 5, she continued. He was 5 years old, and he had his father's eyes, and he always smelled like crayons, even when he hadn't been drawing. She laughed, and it was the most broken laugh Arthur had ever heard. The laugh of someone for whom humor and sorrow have become so tangled they can no longer be separated. He donated his organs. We had discussed it, his father and I had made the decision when he was born to have him registered, because that was the rational thing, the compassionate thing. And when it actually happened, I couldn't, she stopped. "You don't have to," Arthur started. "I want to." She looked up at him. Her eyes, stripped of every defensive artifice, were a dark, clear gray. "I need to. I've been angry for 2 years. At the driver. At the hospital. At my ex-husband. At the recipient. Your daughter." She swallowed. "At this little girl I'd never met. For being alive when James wasn't." The words fell into the room like stones into still water. "That's not rational," she said quietly, before Arthur could respond. "I know it isn't. I know she is not the reason James died. I know that what she has, the heart she carries, doesn't diminish him. But grief doesn't follow the rules of rationality. It follows its own rules, and they are terrible." She looked back down at Lily. "She's beautiful," she whispered. "She is," Arthur said. A silence. Then, "I owe you an apology." She didn't look up from Lily as she said it. "Not just for tonight. For however my anger may have rippled out. I don't know if you've been aware of me. I suspect not. I've been aware of you, of her, at a distance, through information I wasn't supposed to have. Medical privacy, I know. But I have resources, and I used them. And I knew there was a recipient, and I hated her from a distance. And then she stopped herself. That's a confession, not an apology. I'm sorry. For tonight. For treating you as though your child's life were an inconvenience." Arthur looked at her for a long moment. "You're going to leave this room," he said quietly. "And you're going to come back when she's awake, if you want to. I'm not making any other decisions tonight. She's sick, and I need to focus on her." Victoria nodded. She lifted her hand from Lily's chest with the careful reluctance of someone releasing something they are not certain they will be allowed to hold again. She picked up her handbag from the floor, and she walked out. Evans watched her go with a bewildered expression that was rapidly cycling through damage control calculations. He turned to Arthur with a smile that was considerably more uncertain than the one he'd worn entering the room. "Mr. Pendleton, I want to assure you that we're delighted to accommodate Lily in this room for as long as Dr. Evans." Arthur did not look at him. He was looking at his daughter. "I would appreciate it if you left now, too." Evans left. Martha lingered a moment. She met Arthur's eyes, and what passed between them was too complex for words. Recognition, exhaustion, something that might, in other circumstances, have been called relief. "She didn't know," Martha said softly. "That Lily was here. It was coincidence." "I know," Arthur said. He sat down beside his daughter again and took her hand. Are you all right? He thought about that for a moment with the honest, careful consideration he gave to most things. Ask me in the morning, he said. Martha nodded and left them to the heartbeat and the quiet. Morning came gray and slow through the hospital window. Lily's fever had broken around 4 a.m. A gradual, merciful easing that Arthur had monitored through the night with the focused attention that had kept him awake and would keep him functional for the duration of whatever came next. By the time the dawn light began to gray the city skyline beyond the window, Lily was sleeping peacefully, her temperature down to 99.1, the color returning to her cheeks. Arthur drank bad coffee from a machine down the hall and let his mind go where it had been trying to go since the previous night. 2 years was a long time to carry something, and a surprisingly short time simultaneously. This was one of the things about grief that nobody told you before it happened. Its relationship with time was not linear. You could go 6 weeks without being ambushed by it, and then it would arrive at 3 in the morning without warning and take you completely apart, and you would be back at the beginning again, raw and disoriented, not sure which version of yourself you were supposed to be operating as. He allowed himself, in the gray quiet of the hospital morning, to go back, just briefly, just to understand what last night had meant in the context of everything that preceded it. 2 years and 4 months ago, Arthur Pendleton had been a different version of himself. He had been Dr. Arthur Pendleton, Associate Chief of Pediatric Cardiovascular Surgery at Whitmore Children's Hospital in Boston, a position he had reached at 32 years old, which had made him the youngest person to hold it in the hospital's 90-year history. He had published 47 papers. He had developed a modified surgical approach to pediatric aortic repair that now bore his name, the Pendleton Protocol, and was taught in surgical residency programs at 15 major American universities. He had, by any measurable standard, been at the apex of his professional life. He had also been a husband and a father of a 5-year-old, and neither of those roles had ever felt less than the most important thing in his life, no matter how loud the professional accolades grew. Claire had died on a Wednesday in October. A brain aneurysm, the kind that announces itself with catastrophic suddenness, no warning, no preceding symptoms, just the ordinary Tuesday evening. She'd been helping Lily with a drawing of a horse, becoming, without transition, the end. She was gone before the paramedics arrived. Arthur had been in surgery when it happened. He had come home to find his neighbor holding a devastated, confused Lily, and had understood, from his neighbor's face before a word was spoken, that the structure of his life had just been altered beyond recovery. He would have survived that. He had believed, in those first raw weeks, that he would find a way through it, for Lily's sake, because Lily needed him, because that was the only direction forward that he could see. He had taken a leave of absence from Whitmore. He had moved back to his parents' house in Connecticut for 3 months. He had done the brutal, daily work of continuing to exist. And then Lily had gotten sick. The diagnosis had come at the end of November. Dilated cardiomyopathy, progressing rapidly, the kind that in a child of 5 moves quickly from diagnosis to crisis. The irony that a pediatric heart surgeon was sitting across from a colleague receiving the prognosis for his own daughter was not lost on Arthur, but irony, like most things, receded to background noise when the immediate emergency was large enough. The transplant had taken place 9 months later, after Lily spent most of that intervening period on the transplant list, in and out of the hospital, tethered to monitoring equipment and careful limitation and the particular bravery of a small child who had decided, with no evident awareness of how extraordinary this decision was, that she was going to be fine. She had been right. She had come through the surgery with the stubborn, irrepressible vitality that had characterized her since birth, and had sat up in her recovery bed 12 hours post-op and asked Arthur if she could have chocolate pudding. But Arthur had not been the same after. It was not the surgery itself. The surgery had gone as well as anyone could have hoped. It was the experience of sitting on the other side of the table, of being the family rather than the surgeon, of understanding, viscerally, and without the protective distance of professional role, what his patient's parents had felt all the years he had stood before them and delivered news both terrible and hopeful. He had known it in theory. Of course he had. You could not do this work without empathy, without some imaginative understanding of the other side. But knowing and knowing were different, and he had crossed from the first into the second during those 9 months, and he had come out the other side fundamentally changed. He had resigned from Whitmore 6 weeks after Lily's transplant. He had filed the paperwork himself, hand-delivered it to the chief of staff, and declined the offer to take a year-long leave rather than resign outright. The chief had looked at him for a long time and then said, quietly, "Arthur, you are the best surgeon I have ever trained. This is a loss I don't know how to measure." And Arthur had said, "I know. I'm sorry, but my daughter needs her father more than she needs a surgeon." And he had meant it with the kind of bone-deep certainty that comes from having looked directly at what you value most and seen, with perfect clarity, its precise relationship to everything else. He had changed his name back to the one he'd been born with, Pendleton, not the professional name he'd published under, which was Pendleton Marsh, after his mother's family. He had sold the Boston house, the good car, the accumulated material evidences of a decade of high professional achievement. He had taken what remained after Lily's medical debts and moved them to Hargrove, which was small enough to feel manageable and large enough to have a good pediatric cardiac team. And he had gotten a job at Gallagher's Auto Repair because Patrick Gallagher was an old friend who did not ask questions. He had told no one who he was. He had told no one what he had done or what he knew. He had simply become the man who brought his daughter to the park on weekends, who packed her lunchbox with the same disciplined affection he brought to everything, who sat beside her bed on the bad nights and read her Harry Potter in a voice that never wavered, and who went to work every morning with grease on his hands and the particular piece of a person who has chosen their life with full knowledge of the alternatives. He thought about all of this in the gray morning, and he thought about Victoria Sterling on her knees on the linoleum floor, and he thought about James Sterling, who had been 5 years old when he died and who had, through the extraordinary generosity of his brief existence, given Lily more years of life. He had thought about that donor family before. Of course he had. He had thought about them with the specific, complicated gratitude that could not be discharged through any ordinary expression, the kind of gratitude that required something more than thank you, that carried within it an awareness of someone else's devastation that was inseparable from your own relief. He had tried, early on, to initiate contact through the proper channels. The family had declined. He had understood that. He had let it go. He had not expected to be sitting in a hospital room, watching dawn come through a window, while the specific shape of that grief appeared in a cashmere coat. Victoria came back at 10 o'clock in the morning. She was dressed differently, still well-dressed, but in a quieter way, a dark blue sweater and simple trousers, her hair down rather than up, and no jewelry except a small gold ring on her right hand that looked older than everything else she wore. She had, Arthur noticed, done something to repair her face, but not entirely. There were shadows under her eyes that spoke of a night without sleep, and a rawness around her eyes that no amount of careful makeup fully resolved. She knocked before she entered. Lily, who was sitting up in bed eating scrambled eggs and watching the morning clouds move across the hospital window, turned at the sound and regarded the new arrival with the frank, uncomplicated assessment of a 7-year-old. "You're the lady from last night," Lily said. "You were crying on the floor." Victoria stopped in the doorway. A brief pause. "Yes," she said. "I was." Lily considered this with the thoughtful earnestness that was one of her defining characteristics. "Are you okay now?" Another pause. "I'm working on it," Victoria said, and she said it with a plainness that Arthur recognized as something very different from the register she had operated in the night before. "Less performance. More person. Daddy cries sometimes," Lily said helpfully. "But not at night when he thinks I'm asleep. I always wake up, though." She added this as a matter of record, without accusation. Arthur, from his chair in the corner, looked at his daughter with an expression that was equal parts love and rueful embarrassment. "Lily, it's true," she said serenely. "He thinks it's a secret." She looked back at Victoria. "Do you want to come in? There's a chair." Victoria looked at Arthur over his daughter's head. The question was in her eyes, "May I?" as it had been in her hands the night before. That same tentative permission-seeking that sat so strangely on a woman who was accustomed to requiring permission from no one. Arthur gestured toward the chair on the other side of the bed. Victoria sat, and for the next hour, the three of them were simply people in a room together. Lily asking questions with cheerful, unself-conscious curiosity, Victoria answering with a careful, growing honesty, and Arthur watching from his chair with the steady attention of a man who is simultaneously feeling something and evaluating it, a combination that he had always found, in himself, both useful and exhausting. Victoria came back the next day, and the day after that. By the third day, Lily had decided that Victoria was interesting. This was a significant designation in Lily Pendleton's taxonomy of people. She sorted the world into categories with the quiet efficiency of a natural scientist: boring, fine, interesting, and really, really good. Arthur occupied the unassailable last category. Most people fell somewhere in the first two. Interesting was reserved for people who told her things she hadn't known before, who answered her questions without condescension, or who demonstrated some capability she found genuinely impressive. Victoria had made interesting by explaining, unprompted and in accurate detail, how tides worked, when Lily had asked why the moon picture on the hospital's decorative wall calendar sometimes showed it big and sometimes showed it small. "That's the moon's phases," Victoria had said, and then, instead of stopping there as most adults did, she had continued, "And it affects the oceans, did you know? The moon pulls the water toward it as the earth turns, so the tides follow it around the planet." Lily had stared at her with wide eyes. "The moon pulls the sea. Everything with mass pulls everything else with mass. That's gravity. Newton worked it out about 350 years ago." Newton was also the person with the apple, Lily had said, with the satisfied air of someone contributing to a collaborative knowledge-building exercise. The very same. Was it a true story? The apple? Probably not literally, but the story captures the truth of the insight. Lily had looked at Arthur. "Daddy, I want to learn more about gravity." "We can arrange that," Arthur said. He had been watching Victoria during this exchange with the careful, measuring attention he brought to things that mattered. He was, by nature and training, a diagnostician, someone who had learned to observe not just what was presented, but what lay beneath the presentation, the small indicators that told you the real story. And what the small indicators were telling him about Victoria Sterling was complicated. She was intelligent, clearly, sharply, comprehensively so, in the way of someone for whom intelligence is so fundamental it doesn't need to announce itself. She was kind to Lily with a tenderness that was absolutely not performed, that seemed to come from somewhere real and urgent in her. When Lily was tired and a little cranky on the afternoon of the third day, and said something sharp to Arthur, "I don't want the medicine. It tastes disgusting, and I don't care if it helps. It's horrible." Arthur had administered it anyway with firm patience, and Victoria had not intervened, had not tried to win points with the child by taking her side. She had waited until afterward, when Lily was sulking, and had told her quietly about a time when she had been very sick as a girl and had had to take something that tasted like rubber dissolved in motor oil, and it had been awful, and she had been miserable about it, and also it had worked. Lily had considered this and eventually said, with the gravity of someone conceding a significant point, "Okay, fine. It was not these things, taken individually, that were making Arthur's carefully maintained defenses begin, in certain vulnerable moments, to develop small fractures. It was the accumulation. It was the way she asked Lily's nurse intelligent questions about the medications and what they were treating and wrote the answers in a small notebook she kept in her sweater pocket. It was the way she looked at Lily when the child was busy with something and didn't notice. That particular look, private and raw and full of something that went beyond the grief of James's heart, something that seemed to be becoming about Lily herself, about this specific child in this specific bed. It was the morning he had caught Victoria looking at his hands. He had been reviewing Lily's morning chart. The night nurse always left it on the table, and Arthur always reviewed it, a habit so automatic it didn't register to him as anything noteworthy, cross-referencing the overnight vitals, checking the medication notations against his own mental timeline of Lily's last dose. His hands moved across the chart with a precision that was old and ingrained, that went all the way back to the first year of medical school, when a surgical attending had spent 3 months drilling into him the discipline of reading, actually reading, not scanning. When he looked up, Victoria was watching him with an expression he couldn't immediately categorize. "You're not just looking at it," she said. "Sorry, you're not just glancing at it because you're her father and you want to feel like you're doing something useful." She tilted her head slightly. "You're reading it. Clinically." Arthur set the chart down with care. "I read a lot," he said, which was true and also, strictly speaking, insufficient. She held his gaze for a moment. "My ex-husband is a surgeon," she said. "Not pediatric, orthopedic." But the way you held that chart is the same way he holds patient records. The way you move is. She stopped, started again. Last Tuesday, when the junior resident came in and said he wanted to adjust Lily's anti-rejection dosage, you questioned him about it. You asked about the specific drug interaction. You cited the metabolic pathway. You asked why he was adjusting the dosage in a downward direction rather than monitoring for a longer baseline period. I read, Arthur said again. Victoria looked at him steadily. He went away and came back an hour later and said he'd reviewed the case and was going to maintain the current dosage after all. Good, Arthur said. Who are you? She asked. Not hostile, genuinely curious. The question of someone who is used to having access to information and is confronting a gap that doesn't quite make sense. He looked at her for a long moment. Through the window behind her, the city moved and breathed in its ordinary way. Traffic, pedestrians, the slow accumulation of a Wednesday morning. I'm Lily's father, he said. That's the only answer that matters right now. She nodded, slowly, and let it go. But he could see that she was filing it away and that the file was growing. By Friday, Lily was well enough to be cranky about being confined to bed, which Arthur regarded as an excellent sign. Dr. Richard Evans had, since the incident on Tuesday evening, adopted toward Arthur the particular variety of professional courtesy that is indistinguishable from hostility, formally polite in every visible interaction, while ensuring that every invisible interaction ran as smoothly as possible for everyone except Arthur. The room service was mysteriously slower than it had been. The overnight call button response times had lengthened. The junior residents assigned to Lily's care were younger and less experienced than the situation arguably warranted. Arthur had noticed all of this and said nothing, because what he needed was for Lily to get well, not for Evans to be put in his place, and those two priorities were, for the moment, most efficiently pursued by ignoring the second entirely. It was on Friday afternoon that Evans overplayed his hand. He came into the room at 2 o'clock while Arthur was helping Lily with a puzzle. One of the large floor puzzles that Victoria had brought that morning, a detailed map of the solar system that Lily had received with a gasp of delight and immediately begun treating as urgent work. Evans was carrying a tablet, and he had the studied casualness of someone who has prepared a speech and is trying to deliver it as though it is entirely spontaneous. Mr. Pendleton, he said, pleasantly, I've been reviewing Lily's care plan, and in consultation with our pharmacy team, I'd like to suggest a modification to her anti-rejection protocol. Arthur placed a puzzle piece, Saturn, with its rings, and looked up. What modification? Evans pulled up the tablet and turned it toward Arthur. We'd like to transition her from tacrolimus to a generic cyclosporin formulation. It's an equally effective immunosuppressant and considerably more cost-effective. We have a patient financial assistance program that her tacrolimus levels are stable, Arthur said. She's been on this protocol since the transplant. Her body has adapted to this specific drug at this specific dosage. Switching formulations in a post-transplant pediatric patient outside of a monitored clinical setting without documented clinical necessity is not an equivalent substitution. Generic cyclosporin has a significantly narrower therapeutic index. Evans blinked. Mr. Pendleton, I understand this is confusing if you're not familiar with. The therapeutic window for cyclosporin in pediatric post-transplant patients is approximately half the width of tacrolimus, Arthur said. It requires more frequent monitoring, more precise dosing, and has a higher risk profile for nephrotoxicity, specifically in young female patients. Lily is 7 years old, post-transplant, currently recovering from a febrile episode. This is not the appropriate moment to introduce a formulation change. Evans stared at him. I'm not approving this change, Arthur said. He turned back to the puzzle. If you'd like to discuss it further, I'd like the relevant literature to support the clinical necessity, a written second opinion from Dr. Vasquez, and a written risk analysis. I'd also like the decision documented so that if there are any downstream complications, the record reflects who made it. The silence was quite long. Evans's pleasant expression had developed something beneath it, a hard, cold quality that was closer to his real feelings on the matter. Mr. Pendleton, he said, and his voice had flattened. I don't know where you've been reading, but I want to be quite clear. The clinical decisions for your daughter's care are made by qualified medical professionals, not by her mechanic. The last word landed with deliberate precision. I would strongly advise you not to interfere with your daughter's treatment plan, or I will have to speak to you about restricted access to this ward. Lily had gone very still during this exchange, her puzzle piece forgotten in her hand, watching the two men with the attentive seriousness of a child who understands that something important is happening without understanding all of its contents. Arthur looked at Evans with an expression that was perfectly calm and, because of that perfect calm, considerably more unsettling than any display of anger would have been. Document the change in writing, he said quietly. Your name on the order, your clinical rationale, your review signature. And I'll arrange for Dr. Vasquez to review it before implementation. Evans's jaw tightened. I could have you removed from this ward. You could try, Arthur said. But I'd encourage you to think carefully about the medical and legal implications of restricting a primary guardian's access to a minor patient's care on the basis of a treatment disagreement, particularly when the treatment in question is being changed for cost rather than clinical reasons. Evans left. Lily looked at her father. Daddy, she said after a moment, what's a therapeutic index? It's a measurement of how precise a medication needs to be dosed, Arthur said, returning to the puzzle. Too little and it doesn't work. Too much and it can hurt you. Some medicines have a wide gap between those 2 points. Some have a very narrow one, which means they need to be watched very carefully. Lily turned this over, found Jupiter in the pile, and placed it. Dr. Evans doesn't like you, she observed. I noticed, Arthur said. Victoria doesn't like Dr. Evans, Lily added, with the satisfied tone of someone completing a logical circuit. She told me yesterday he has the energy of someone who peaked in his career a decade ago and has been coasting on the wreckage ever since. Arthur almost laughed. Victoria said that to you? She said it to the window while I was pretending to be asleep. Lily looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. You, Arthur said, are a menace. Lily grinned, and for a moment she looked so completely, perfectly herself, so completely alive and here in his, that Arthur had to look away, at the window, at the gray sky, at the particular mercy of an ordinary Friday afternoon. The inspection was scheduled for Monday, and nobody had told Arthur about it. This was not an oversight. Evans had very deliberately ensured that the notification about the board inspection didn't reach the 4th floor until the Saturday prior, when it was likely that Arthur would be less focused on hospital administrative matters. What Evans had not anticipated was that Arthur did not operate on a schedule of lesser focus. He was always focused. It was one of the things about him that Evans found, without entirely understanding why, persistently alarming. The board arrived at 10:30 on Monday morning. 6 people in good suits and the measured purposefulness of those who carry genuine institutional authority. They were accompanied by the hospital's senior administrative team, and, walking beside them with the comfortable authority of a man who needs no escort, an elderly figure in a dark gray suit who moved through the hospital corridors with the particular ease of someone returning to familiar territory. Professor Edward Wainwright was 81 years old, slight and silver-haired, with the bright, sharp eyes of a mind that age had not meaningfully diminished. He had been chair of cardiovascular surgery at Johns Hopkins for 22 years. He had trained a generation of the finest cardiac surgeons currently practicing in the United States. He had, among many other things, been Arthur Pendleton's mentor, his teacher, and for a brief and formative period, the person who had shaped the finest surgical mind of his generation into what it was capable of becoming. He had not seen Arthur since Arthur's resignation. The board was touring the 4th floor at 11 o'clock. Evans walking at the head of the group with the cautious enthusiasm of a man managing a high-stakes performance review, pointing out the new monitoring equipment, the upgraded nursing station, the recently refurbished family lounge. It was during the walkthrough of the corridor outside room 412. Lily was doing physical therapy exercises in the common room at the other end of the hall, that Evans was mid-sentence about the hospital's commitment to patient-centered care when Professor Wainwright stopped walking. He stopped so abruptly that the administrative assistant behind him nearly walked into him. He was looking at a man at the end of the corridor who was carrying 2 cups of coffee from the ward kitchen and was returning to his daughter's room with the unhurried, economical stride of someone who has been navigating this particular stretch of hallway for a week. Arthur, Wainwright said. It was not loud. It didn't need to be. It had the quality of something long held finally being said. Arthur stopped. He looked down the corridor at Wainwright, and the expression on his face was difficult to read. Complicated, held carefully in check, but something moved through it that was unmistakably recognition and something further, the specific something that happens when a person's past comes into contact with their present and both have to reconfigure. He walked toward them. "Professor Wainwright," he said. The old man crossed the remaining distance and took both of Arthur's hands in his own, the gesture of someone who has known another person's hands in their most essential capacity and recognizes them across time. He looked at Arthur for a long moment, at the worn shirt, the work-calloused hands, the coffee cups, the quiet steadiness of a man who has made a choice and kept it. "My God," he said softly. "There you are." Evans had gone pale. Not immediately. The pallor came in stages, as the pieces assembled themselves with the particular inevitability of a diagnosis arriving. He watched Wainwright hold Arthur's hands. He heard the murmur of words exchanged too quietly for him to catch. He saw one of the other board members, the chief of medical staff, a sharp-faced woman named Dr. Patricia Holloway, lean toward her neighbor and say something that made the neighbor blink and look more carefully at Arthur. "You're Pendleton Marsh," Holloway said, stepping forward. Not a question. Arthur met her gaze. "Arthur Pendleton," he said. "Pendleton Marsh was my professional name." "The Pendleton Protocol," she said. It wasn't a question either. "Yes." Wainwright turned to the board with the calm authority of a man who has been the most important person in every room he's entered for 6 decades. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this is Dr. Arthur Pendleton. He published his first surgical paper at 24 years old. He was the youngest associate chief of pediatric cardiovascular surgery in Whitmore's history. He developed the modified aortic repair technique that bears his name and is now taught in residency programs across 15 universities." A pause. "He is, in my considered opinion, the most gifted pediatric cardiac surgeon I have ever trained in 50 years of practice." The corridor was very quiet. Evans's clipboard had dropped to his side. The blood had left his face entirely. Arthur said, to Wainwright, "I retired from practice to care for my daughter. I'm not returning to surgery." "I know," Wainwright said. "We can talk about that. Right now, I just wanted to find you." He looked at Arthur with the expression of a man who has said everything he needed to say in the inflection of those last 3 words. Arthur looked at Evans. Evans was discovering, in real time, the specific physiological symptoms of professional terror. The cold that started in the extremities and moved inward, the rigidity in the chest, the sense of the floor having lost whatever confidence he had previously placed in its solidity. He had spent a week treating a man he considered beneath his notice with a contempt he had not troubled to disguise, a man who had now been identified, in front of the hospital's entire board of directors, as someone whose name was in the surgical textbooks. "Dr. Evans," Dr. Holloway said, in a tone that had cooled considerably, "we'd like to review the recent changes you've proposed to patient Lily Pendleton's care protocol. I understand you suggested a formulation change to her anti-rejection medication." Evans opened his mouth. Without documented clinical necessity, Holloway continued, "And over the documented objection of the patient's guardian, who, it turns out, has rather more medical expertise than your chart notes suggested." Evans stopped. "I wasn't aware." "No," Holloway said. "You weren't." She looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone performing a rapid but thorough professional reassessment. "I think we have a great deal to discuss, Dr. Evans." Wainwright placed a hand briefly on Arthur's shoulder. "Your daughter," he said quietly. "Is she well?" "Better," Arthur said. "She'll be well." The old man nodded, and the light in his eyes said everything that needed to be said about what it meant to him that this was the answer. Victoria had been in Lily's room when the corridor conversation happened. She'd heard fragments through the open door, enough fragments to understand the shape of what was occurring and to experience it with a complicated satisfaction that was not at all diminished by the fact that she'd spent most of the past week quietly investigating Arthur Pendleton herself. She had resources. She used them carefully these days, with rather more consideration for consequence than she'd applied to most things before James died. But she had, over the course of the past week, assembled a picture that confirmed and exceeded the hypothesis that his careful hands and clinical questions had been building. She knew who he was. She had known since Thursday. She had said nothing. She was still processing what it meant, not the professional identity, which was extraordinary enough, but the choice he had made, which was something of a different magnitude entirely. A man who had been that brilliant, who had been at the very apex of a field that required the combination of technical mastery and human stakes that few professions could equal, who had chosen to set it all down and become ordinary in the exact measure that his daughter needed him to be present. That was a choice that said something about character that could not be said any other way. She was in the room when the board entered, led by Wainwright and Holloway, and Evans followed behind them with the specific posture of a man walking toward an appointment he cannot avoid. The board review of Lily's case was thorough and not comfortable for Evans. Holloway had read the notes Arthur had requested be documented, Evans's proposed medication change, Arthur's objection, the clinical reasoning Arthur had cited. She asked Evans twice to explain the clinical justification for the formulation switch, and twice Evans's answer was insufficient. She asked him to explain the documented complaint of delayed nursing response on the 4th floor that had been filed by Martha Hayes the previous week. Evans's answer was more insufficient still. "I need to understand," Holloway said, with a precision that was very much like a scalpel, whether the treatment differential on this case was related to the patient's family's apparent financial status. Because what I'm reading here describes a pattern of care degradation that aligns rather precisely with a guardian dispute that had absolutely nothing to do with clinical judgment. Evans had, by this point, achieved a stillness that was beyond strategic. He was simply no longer able to construct a defense that covered the facts. Victoria, who had been sitting quietly in the chair beside Lily's bed, watching all of this with the focused attention of a woman who had destroyed 8 hostile corporate takeover attempts and 3 fraudulent partnerships in the past decade, chose this moment to speak. "While the board is conducting its review," she said pleasantly, "it may also be useful to note that Sterling Global Holdings is in the process of evaluating a significant capital investment in this institution. I've been on site this week and have formed a number of views about management culture and patient care practices that I'll be sharing with our investment committee." The room absorbed this. "I was also present," she continued, in the same pleasant register, "on the evening of Tuesday last, when Dr. Evans instructed security personnel to physically remove a man whose 7-year-old daughter, a post-cardiac transplant patient, was lying in a hospital bed with a fever of 104 on the basis that a private individual required that specific room for a pet animal. I am prepared to provide that testimony in any formal review process." Evans looked at her. He looked at Arthur. He looked at the board. Arthur was standing near the window, his arms crossed, his expression composed. He had said very little during the board discussion. He did not need to say much. The facts, properly documented and presented by people with the authority to present them, were doing the work. "Dr. Evans," Dr. Holloway said, and the finality in her voice was absolute, "I'd like you to accompany us to the administrative suite. We're going to have a comprehensive conversation about management practice, clinical oversight, and professional conduct." Evans left the room without looking at Arthur. The door closed. Wainwright, who had been standing near the wall throughout this final exchange, looked at Arthur with the expression of a man allowing himself the luxury of a moment's satisfaction. "He'll be gone within the week," he said quietly. "I know," Arthur said. He looked at Lily, who was watching this entire proceeding with the bright, serious eyes of a child who is cataloging everything for later. "That's not why I'm here." "I know that too," Wainwright said, "but I'm glad it happened anyway." Later, when Wainwright had gone and the board had retreated to the administrative suite and the ordinary rhythms of the afternoon had reasserted themselves, Evans was placed on administrative suspension pending a formal review. The investigation that followed over the next 2 weeks would find a documented pattern of differential patient treatment based on apparent socioeconomic status, improper clinical recommendations motivated by departmental budget targets, and multiple instances of misrepresenting treatment necessity to patient families. His medical license was referred to the state board. Martha Hayes, when she heard the outcome, made herself a cup of tea in the break room and drank it with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has waited 27 years for precisely this cup of tea. That evening, Arthur was offered the position of Chief of Pediatric Cardiovascular Surgery at Hargrove City Medical Center, effective upon his return to active practice. At whatever terms he found acceptable, he read the offer letter carefully. He folded it in thirds. He put it in his jacket pocket. "Daddy," said Lily, who had watched him read it. What did it say? It's a job offer, he said. A surgery job. Yes. She thought about this with great seriousness. Do you want to? He looked at her, at the heart monitor, at the window, where the city was beginning to put on its evening lights, at Victoria, who was sitting in her chair on the other side of the bed with an expression of careful stillness, waiting for his answer with the same quality of attention he had come to associate with her. The attention of someone who has learned that the things worth knowing require patience. I want to be wherever you need me to be, he said. I'm going to be fine, Lily said, with great conviction. I'm very strong. My heart is very strong. She looked at Victoria. Right? Victoria's throat moved. Right? She said softly. The rejection episode came at 3:17 on Wednesday morning that IT announced itself first on the monitor. A subtle arrhythmic variation that Arthur, even in the light sleep he'd taught himself to maintain beside Lily's bed, registered before he was fully awake. He was at her side before the alarm had finished its second tone, his hand on her wrist, his eyes on the numbers, his mind already running the differential. Lily was awake. Her eyes were open and frightened in a way that she was trying very hard not to show. Daddy, she said. My chest. I know, he said. Lie still. I'm here. What followed was the specific, controlled chaos of a medical emergency in a hospital. The night nurse responding to the alarm, the rapid response team arriving, the resident on call appearing at the door with the particular combination of alertness and anxiety that characterized junior medical personnel at 3 in the morning. Dr. Vasquez, reached by phone, arrived from home in 22 minutes, during which time Arthur stood at his daughter's bedside and managed the room with the quiet, irresistible authority of a man who had stopped being a surgeon but had never stopped being one that he did not command. He did not override. He questioned, precisely and rapidly, the resident's assessment of the presenting arrhythmia, suggested a specific echocardiographic finding to check that the resident had not prioritized, and was correct. He requested, not ordered, that the immunosuppression protocol be reviewed against the specific parameters of Lily's post-transplant baseline rather than standard pediatric reference values. Dr. Vasquez arrived, assessed the situation in 90 seconds, looked at Arthur, and said, You've already worked out what's happening. Low-grade rejection response, probably triggered by the febrile episode last week stressing the immune system, Arthur said. Manageable with adjusted immunosuppression and close monitoring. She doesn't need the OR. Vasquez nodded, already issuing orders. Stay here, she said to Arthur. Talk to me. For the next 2 hours, Arthur guided his daughter's care the way he had guided the care of hundreds of other people's children over the years, with the technical fluency of someone for whom this knowledge was as natural as breathing, and with the specific, burning terror of a father, which was new and different, and which he tucked behind his professionalism with the same disciplined focus he had applied to everything else in the past 2 years, because Lily needed the former and could not be served by the latter. Lily was stabilized by 5 o'clock. By 5:30, she was asleep again, her vitals steady, the color returned to her face, the heart monitor drawing its familiar green line with reassuring regularity. Arthur stepped into the corridor. He stood against the wall, pressed both hands flat against the cool surface of it, tilted his head back, and closed his eyes. The PTSD. That was what Dr. Meadow, the therapist he'd seen briefly 18 months ago, had called it. Though Arthur had been resistant to the term in the specific way that surgeons often were about conditions that suggested loss of control, manifested not as flashback, but as a physical and emotional convergence of past and present that made the boundary between them temporarily unclear. He knew where he was. He knew this was not the moment Claire had died, was not the operating room where Lily had received her transplant. He knew these things with the rational clarity of a man whose mind was designed for precision. He also felt, for several minutes, exactly as though all of those things were happening simultaneously. He pressed his hands against the wall and breathed. He felt a hand on his arm. Victoria was standing beside him in the corridor. She was still wearing the clothes she'd arrived in the previous morning. She had stayed through the evening, had been sleeping, or trying to, in the family lounge down the hall. Her hair was loose around her face, and she looked exhausted and pale and completely without pretense. She didn't say anything. She simply put her hand on his arm with a steadiness that was very much like the quality he had first noticed in her with Lily. The stillness of someone who has learned that the most useful thing you can do for another person, sometimes, is simply to remain. After a while, Arthur said, "I should have been able to prevent this." "You were here," Victoria said. "You worked out what was happening before the on-call resident. You guided her treatment. She's stable. If I'd been practicing, Arthur." She said his name with a quiet force that made him turn his head. "You were here. You were here. That's what she needed. You being present. You being her father." A pause. "I've watched you this week. I've watched what you are to her, and I don't mean the medicine." Her voice had thinned slightly. "I mean the puzzle and the coffee and the way you read to her, and the way she looks at you like you are the fixed point the whole world turns around. That is what is keeping her well, not the protocol." He looked at her. Her gray eyes were direct and steady and full of something she had not, until this moment, permitted herself to show him fully. "James," she said, after a moment, "used to come and find me at night when he had bad dreams. He would walk all the way down the corridor and stand in the doorway of my room and just wait there until I woke up and saw him. And then he'd come and get in the bed with me and fall asleep immediately." She smiled, and it was the most unguarded smile he had seen from her. "He didn't need anything except to know I was there. That was enough." The smile faded. "I didn't understand, then, how completely that is everything. Being there, being the fixed point." They stood in the corridor for a while longer. "You saved her," Victoria said, more quietly. "Lily, you saved her twice. Once in the operating room, because whoever had that table, you would have guided it differently even if you weren't holding the instruments tonight. And once by being exactly who you chose to be for the past 2 years." Arthur was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He sounds like he was remarkable." "James." Victoria's breath caught. "He was," she said. "He was extraordinary. He was kind in a way that made absolutely no sense for 5 years old. He used to try to share his snack with homeless people we passed on the street, every single time, from about the age of 3. He would announce to anyone who would listen that his mother was the smartest person in the world, which was embarrassing and lovely in equal measure." She paused. "He would have liked you. He liked people who were quiet and real. I think," Arthur said carefully, "that in the way these things can be true, I think he would have liked Lily too." Victoria looked at him with eyes that were full to the edge of spilling. "I think so too," she said. 3 weeks later, on a mild evening in early spring, Arthur and Victoria stood on the hospital roof. It was not a grand roof. It was a utilitarian space, with ventilation equipment and heating units, and a low safety railing along the perimeter, the kind of place hospital staff went to eat lunch away from the ward or to make phone calls in the open air. But it had a good view, westward across Hargrove, where the city's skyline gave way to a gray-green smear of parkland and, beyond it, a horizon wide enough to let the sunset properly occupy it. Lily was being discharged tomorrow morning. She had spent the past 2 weeks recovering from the rejection episode with the same iron, cheerful determination she brought to all adverse circumstances. She had completed her homework assignments, conducted an extensive correspondence with Professor Wainwright, who had visited twice and who Lily had decided fell into the really, really good category, and had immediately begun extracting from him everything he knew about anatomy, which was considerable, and assembled the entire solar system puzzle, with Victoria's assistance, and then disassembled it and assembled it again from memory to demonstrate that she had retained it. Victoria had been there for most of it. Arthur had watched this, carefully as he watched everything, and had seen the gradual and irreversible transformation of something that had begun as guilt and grief into something that was simply, honestly, love. Love of the ordinary, daily kind that builds itself from shared puzzles and morning arguments about whether hospital scrambled eggs were acceptable, and the particular ritual of reading aloud that Victoria had, with Lily's enthusiastic encouragement, joined. First listening, then reading alternate paragraphs, until by the end of the second week she was the one reaching for the book first. He had seen Lily's love for Victoria develop with the direct, uncalculating openness of a child who has a great capacity for affection and no particular reason to withhold it. She had stopped calling her the lady or Miss Sterling sometime in the second week, without comment, replacing it with Victoria, and then, one morning, with a casualness that only barely concealed how deliberate it was, with Vicky. Victoria had gone very still for a moment when Lily used that name for the first time. James called me that, she said. After a beat, Lily looked up from her puzzle. Is that okay? I can call you something else. No, Victoria said, and her voice had the particular texture of something that has been painful becoming, at the same moment, beautiful. No, it's perfect. Now, on the roof, the sunset was doing something extravagant with the clouds, wide bands of orange and deep rose that made the city look, briefly, more generous than it was. Arthur had his hands on the railing. Victoria stood beside him with her arms folded against the chill, close enough that her shoulder was almost touching his. They had been talking, or not talking, in the easy alternation that had characterized the past 3 weeks. The comfortable silence of two people who have said many difficult things to each other and have found, after the difficulty, that the silence between the words is reliable. I want to say something, Victoria said, and I want you to let me finish before you respond. All right. She looked at the horizon. I was not a good person for a long time, she said. Before James, I was driven and ambitious, and I told myself that was the same as being good, which is the kind of lie that ambitious people find very convenient. After James, I was worse. I was the cold, efficient version of myself that has no room for anything, because the alternative to coldness was a grief so large I couldn't function inside it. She paused. I came into that hospital room 3 weeks ago as the worst version of myself, and I treated you and Lily with contempt that I am ashamed of in a way that I expect I will continue to be ashamed of for a long time. You were grieving, she said. I know that's part of it. But grief isn't a permission slip for cruelty, and I think I'd been letting it be one for longer than I want to admit. Arthur was quiet. What I want to say, she continued, is that I am not asking to be part of Lily's life because of James's heart. I understand if that's how this started, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But it isn't why I want to stay. She turned to face him, and her gray eyes in the sunset light were clear and unguarded in the way he had come to recognize as her truest register. I want to stay because of her, because she is the most remarkable child I have ever met, and being near her is like standing in sunlight, and she has given me back something I thought was gone permanently. She took a breath. And because of you, Arthur held her gaze. Because you are the most honest person I've met in years, which is not how I would have described a man in a faded work shirt when I walked into that hospital room. But the corner of her mouth moved, the small, self-aware smile he had come to watch for. My ability to assess people has clearly needed recalibration. She looked down at her hands briefly. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm not making any demands, and I'm not leveraging anything. I'm just telling you the truth, because I think you deserve the truth, and because I have been practicing it recently and finding it considerably less terrifying than I expected. Arthur was quiet for a long moment. The horizon was very wide. The last light of the sun was pooling at the edge of it, warm and level. 2 years ago, he said, I made a decision to step away from everything I'd built professionally because the only thing that made sense to me was being present for one person. And I thought, at the time, that this was probably most of what my life would be for a long time. He paused. I was okay with that. I am still okay with that. Lily is everything. I know, Victoria said. But I have been, he stopped. Started again. I have been lonely in the way that is very particular to people who have lost their person. Not the dramatic kind. The daily kind. The small moments where there's no one to tell the thing that just happened. The evenings. He looked at her. I haven't admitted that to anyone. I'm not sure I've admitted it to myself until about 10 days ago. Victoria looked at him steadily. I need to be Lily's father first, he said. Always. That's not negotiable, and it's not a condition. It's just what is. I know that, she said. I wouldn't want it any other way. And you need to know that this, he gestured briefly, encompassing them, the roof, the conversation, is not a transaction. I don't need your resources or your connections or your name. I need nothing from you that you aren't choosing to give freely. I know that too, she said. Believe me, I know the difference. He looked at her for a long moment. The last light was going gold and low. Then he reached out and took her hand. It was a simple thing. The simplest possible thing. His calloused, work-roughened hand closing around hers, there on the roof above the city, in the cooling spring air, with nothing dramatic and nothing performed and nothing that was anything other than exactly what it was. Victoria looked down at their joined hands. She laughed. A small, surprised sound, genuine in a way he hadn't heard from her before. the laugh of someone catching an unexpected grace. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay." 1 year later, the apartment was full of noise and Saturday morning light. Lily, who was now 8 3/4 and very particular about the distinction, was lying on her stomach on the living room floor with a large book about the cardiovascular system that Wainwright had sent for her birthday, which she had received with a delight that confirmed, in Arthur's mind, that he was raising either a future cardiologist or a person who would describe heart anatomy at dinner parties. Either outcome he was prepared to support. Victoria was making coffee in the kitchen in the way that had become, over the past year, simply what happened on Saturday mornings. The smell of good coffee and the sound of the radio on low and the particular domestic piece of a space that contained people who had chosen to be in it. Arthur sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, working through the consulting framework he'd been developing for the pediatric cardiology unit at Hargrove City Medical Center. He had not returned to active surgery. Not yet. Perhaps not ever, he told himself, though Wainwright continued to have opinions about this. But he had agreed, 3 months ago, to a consulting role that let him use what he knew without requiring him to give what he'd chosen to protect. He went in 2 afternoons a week and reviewed complex cases and occasionally joined surgical planning discussions and told himself, honestly, that this was enough. Most days, he believed it. "Vicky," Lily called from the living room. "Did you know that the heart beats approximately 100,000 times a day?" "I didn't know that," Victoria said, bringing Arthur his coffee and ruffling Lily's hair as she passed. "Actually, I have been sitting next to someone with a very strong heart for a year now, so I've had the subject on my mind." Lily looked up from her book with the bright, satisfied expression of a child who has been correctly seen. "That's me," she confirmed. "That is absolutely you," Victoria agreed. Arthur watched Victoria sit down across from him at the table. She had a coffee of her own and a tablet with the weekend reports from Sterling Global, which she reviewed in about 40 minutes on Saturday mornings and then put away until Monday, a discipline that had apparently required a significant restructuring of her working habits and which Lily had described as Vicky's training arc, a phrase she had picked up from a nature documentary. Victoria caught him looking at her and raised an eyebrow. "What?" "Nothing," he said. He smiled. The real one. The one that didn't happen often and meant more because of it. Her expression shifted to something soft and direct and warm, the particular expression he had come to associate with the moments when she stopped managing herself and was simply present. She had more of these moments now. They came more easily. This was one of the things he had watched happen over the course of a year, and that he considered among the most significant things he had witnessed in recent memory, which was saying a great deal. "Come here," Lily announced from the floor. "Both of you. I need you to be quiet and listen." They looked at each other. "Lily," Arthur said, "what are we listening to?" 100,000 beats a day, she said, and held up the book and smiled at them with the uncomplicated radiance of a child who is everything she needs. "I want to read it out loud." Arthur moved to the floor. Victoria followed. They sat on either side of Lily, her yellow daisy blanket, still, after all this time, her particular comfort, pulled over her legs, the morning light falling across the pages. Lily began to read. And in the small, bright, noisy Saturday morning apartment, in the reliable rhythm of coffee and books and belonging, 3 people who had been broken in 3 separate ways sat together and listened to the facts of the heart. How many chambers, how many valves, how many miles of vessels running through the human body like rivers. How the whole extraordinary structure never stops, not for a moment, not from the very beginning, carrying everything necessary for life from one place to another and then back again, and then again, and then again 100,000 times a day, strong and steady and present and here.